And I want you to put your feet close together, and I want you to stand perfectly still. Now, I want you to be consciously aware of how often you use that little ball at the end of your little toe on your foot to maintain your balance. Okay? You can sit down. Yeah. Cut your toe off, and you have to have special made shoes to keep your balance. So there's a sense in which the image of the body becomes a very image of what the church is. Everything is needed, and everything is needed to work together. And that's why in these first verses, Paul begins the section by reminding his readers and reminding us that the body is a unity. One body made up of many parts. Now, when Charlie was sharing with us the story of the Lights and the Conleys, okay, I don't know the history of this church. But I can tell you the history of other churches, and I hope that wasn't the case here. And I don't think it was, but other churches that I've known of, it was the Smith and the Jones better not sit on the Smith side, and the Smiths better not sit on the Jones side. Okay? I know of a church, when I've shared this with you, where the elders who sat on each side of the communion table didn't talk to each other for years. I know of a church that split over the color of the carpet that was chosen to replace the old carpet. Now somebody's liable to stand up and say, "Now preacher, now you're starting to meddle." But Paul's point is that we are supposed to be one, just as the body is one, even though we are many. And the many of us make up the one. And that's regardless of our race. He says, doesn't matter if it's Jew or Greek. It doesn't matter of your social standing, slave or free. That was pretty important in that day. And it happened. Some of the early writers talked about how unique those Christians were because they could go and stand side by side with slaves as if there was no difference. One, but many. Many, but one. And then in verses 15 to 20 that we read, Paul emphasizes the necessity of having diversity in the body. Each part, such as the eye or the ear, has to be willing to perform its function and not seek to function in a role that it was not made in. Each of us is unique, each of us is gifted, and each of us are to make a difference. I heard somebody specifically say how glad they were that Marilyn was gifted to fill in over here at the instrument when Emma and Diane were absent. Musical gifts that not all of us have. Okay? Some of us have teaching gifts. I am so glad that at Martinton, Mike and Tina Emerson and Bill and Heather Zichtema have stepped up to be the youth group sponsors. Especially junior high and high school. Because God love them, there's something about junior high kids that we don't match very well. I have to skip from the little ones up to the big ones. I told my own two boys that are in junior high, it's a good thing God didn't make parents to eat their young or they'd be gone. Everyone's unique and everyone makes a difference. And the logic of verse 17 is compelling. Nobody can function as all seeing, all hearing, or all smelling. Each of us is important. Now, for the church to function properly, we all have different gifts and offices. And so in verse 18 to 20, Paul brings this back to why. It's God's sovereign purpose. I am more convinced today than I ever have been that God is not as concerned as much about sending missionaries to foreign lands as He is about the church blooming where it's planted. Now, there are areas of the world that have not heard the Word that we need to do whatever we can to raise funds to help those people out. But let me tell you about a discussion that Paul and I and Ezekiel Mbwalo had one night down in Lincoln. The two of them, specifically Paul more than Ezekiel, wanted to know why we refer to their church as missions. Paul said, we're a church just like you're a church. We happen to be a church in Myanmar. You're a church in the United States. Why do you refer to us as missions? And it's a very valid point. We need to quit thinking about them as missions and mission fields and start rethinking about what is the mission that God has given us to do. And the mission that God has given us to do is to make disciples. And the way we make disciples is by teaching and baptizing. Great Commission. And Paul says all of us have been given our gifts by God, and so none is more important than the other. I'm not, how do I want to say this? I'm not real gifted at follow-up. I do a great job of creating ideas and thinking of new things. But for me to really be successful, I need somebody that once I think it up, once I create it, I can say, here, put this into practice for me. Do it. Implement this. I'm not an implementer. My office has stuff everywhere. Now I know where it's at, but I'm not a great organizer. Okay? I can organize better in my head than I can on paper. That's why I often carry a little recorder with me so that when I am traveling and I'm by myself, I can turn that thing on and I can just talk and think and talk and then go back later and write down what I thought and talked about. Each of us is unique, but Paul goes on to say that no one stands alone. We suffer and we rejoice together. Here is our strength. Our strength is not in being alone. I've heard people all the time say, oh, I can just go out into the woods and feel God's presence. Yeah, I can too. But I'm going to tell you this, that if I try to live my Christian life in the woods all by myself, I'm even going to be tempted there. The early church fathers and monastics experienced that. When they tried to pull themselves out away, they had just as many temptations in other areas. And I don't think it's insignificant that in verse 25, Paul uses the word division, that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. I think he uses that very specifically to remind them of what he talked about back in chapter 1, when he began by saying, some of you say you're from Cephas, some of you are Apollos, some of you are even saying you're of Jesus Christ. Division. I don't think there has been any greater detriment to the Church of Jesus Christ in the history of the church than the institution of denominations. When we present an image to the world of division, when we can't even agree over the two essentials. Paul, not once, but more than once, talks about this. Go back to 1 Corinthians 10. Here he talked about baptism and the spiritual drink, communion. In 1 Corinthians 10, he begins, For I don't want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers, that our forefathers were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. He's talking about baptism and communion. And then he says, nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered over the desert. What's the implied message? The implied message is, hey, our forefathers were baptized and had communion. We've been baptized and have communion. Don't think that just because you're baptized and partake of communion that God's pleased with you. Because if you're divided, God is not pleased. And that's why in verse 26, the reminder that if one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. I cannot stand chronic pain. I cannot stand chronic anything. We were in the store the other day and some little kid somewhere in the store was whining and crying. Big store. But no matter how big that store was, Ron, I heard that child whining and crying the whole time I was in there. And I was about to whine and cry. I can handle severe, short term. But when it starts to be chronic. Now, that's why I need someone to be there with me. That's why when my wife said, hey, quit focusing on that. Let's look at this. Because I did say something to her. I said, boy, you probably said it. Good thing that's not one of our kids. Too often, we try to live our Christian life like this. And as soon as financial problems come into the family, we're broken, or maybe it's one of the kids having trouble at school and we don't seem to understand it as parents, or maybe it's a neighbor, and we just keep breaking so easily. When if in the Acts model of the church, Acts chapter 2 especially, we were all meeting together daily, fellowshipping together, eating meals together daily. Then when that problem with school came up, I could say to my friend, hey, I'm having a problem with my son at school. And, I'm really having a hard time getting grip on it. And somebody else in the group there could speak up and say, we've kind of had that same trouble with our child. And all of a sudden, we've got 2 or 3 people here dealing with a problem, and we're a little stronger because we've joined together. One of my favorite passages is found in Philippians chapter 2. I want to close with this. Philippians chapter 2, verse 1 and following. It's another grammar lesson. We had metonymy. I'll ask you questions about that on the test. Now we're having third-class conditional sentences. Third-class conditional sentences are if, then. In a third-class conditional sentence, the if is understood to be true. Okay? So, here's what Paul writes. If you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, obviously we should have. If any comfort from His love. Do I have testimony by way of hand? Has anybody felt comfort from God's love in the last week? Okay. If any fellowship with the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion. You see, if any of these things are true, they all should be true if we're Christians.